In the spring of 1811, laborers tearing down an old tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt the city for generations. Concealed beneath decaying floorboards, they uncovered 8 uniform wooden boxes, each containing a man's wedding ring and a tiny vial of what looked like medicinal powder. The rings bore distinct names and different dates, yet all shared one chilling detail. They had once belonged to the husbands of Ruth Holloway, a woman who had somehow outlived 8 wealthy men within the span of 30 years. What officials uncovered in those vials would challenge everything they believed they knew about the elegant widow, who had once been celebrated as the jewel of Virginia society. The local magistrate ordered the finding sealed from public record, citing matters of delicate nature that could tarnish the standing of prominent families. For over 2 centuries, this case has remained hidden in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. But tonight, we're about to expose the truth behind one of America's most methodical and terrifying killers. Before we move forward with the tale of Ruth Holloway and her fatal unions, I want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready to plunge into America's darkest historical mysteries, and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery lovers across the nation. The story of Ruth Holloway begins not with bloodshed, but with tragedy that would shape the fate of 8 men's lives and deaths. The Virginia of 1780 was a land altered by revolution and haunted by its shadow. In the fertile tobacco region surrounding Richmond and Petersburg, vast plantations sprawled along the James River, their white-pillared mansions standing as monuments to America's newfound wealth. The Revolutionary War had ended just 3 years earlier, but its wounds still ran deep through Virginia society. Loyalist estates had been confiscated and redistributed, creating a fresh class of wealthy patriots while leaving many in ruin. It was into this world of shifting fortunes and buried secrets that Ruth Holloway would step. Ruth arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782, a striking woman of 28 with auburn hair and eyes like winter fog. She claimed to be the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a Continental Army officer who had supposedly perished at the Battle of Yorktown. Her tale was simple yet heartbreaking. She had lost everything in the war and sought to start anew in Virginia, drawn by reports of the state's prosperity and the warmth of its people. What made Ruth exceptional was not merely her beauty, but her intelligence and polish. She spoke with the refined cadence of educated New England, could read Latin, and possessed a vast knowledge of medicinal herbs and treatments. In an age when medical care was crude and physicians scarce, Ruth's healing skills swiftly made her indispensable to Richmond's elite society. She carried with her a leather-bound journal filled with remedies she claimed had been passed down through generations of her family. The Virginia gentry embraced Ruth with open arms. The war had created a shortage of eligible women, as many had died from illness or fled with loyalist kin. Here was a cultivated widow of impeccable manners who could debate politics with the men and healing arts with the women. Within months of her arrival, Ruth had secured herself in a modest but respectable home on Clay Street, supporting herself by treating ailments ranging from consumption to nervous disorders. But beneath Richmond's polished surface, darker currents moved. The war had birthed not only heroes but profiteers and traitors. Whispers in drawing rooms told of men who had switched allegiance for old, of supply convoys mysteriously ambushed by those familiar with their roots, of patriot leaders betrayed to British hands. Some suspected the existence of a covert network that had conspired with the enemy, yet proof remained elusive. These men had not only endured the war but flourished in its wake, their treachery rewarded with seized loyalist lands and lucrative government deals. It was in this climate of prosperity born from betrayal that Ruth Holloway began her lethal courtship with Virginia's most notable citizens. She seemed to possess an uncanny gift for drawing the gaze of the colony's most accomplished men: tobacco barons, shipping tycoons, land speculators, and political dignitaries. Each fell under her charm. Each wed her with great ceremony, and each died under conditions that, while suspicious to modern eyes, appeared perfectly natural to their peers. The first sign that something was amiss came from an unexpected source: the slaves who toiled in the great houses where Ruth's husbands resided. They murmured among themselves about the strange sicknesses that plagued their masters after marriage, always starting with stomach pains, followed by weakness and ending in death. But in a society where slave testimony bore no legal weight, their warnings were dismissed as superstition and envy. The first death came on a sweltering August night in 1783, barely 6 months after Ruth had married Colonel Edmund Fairfax, one of Richmond's most prosperous tobacco merchants. Fairfax, a vigorous man of 45 who had never displayed any signs of sickness, was discovered lifeless in his study by his house servant, Jupiter, at sunrise on August the 15th. Jupiter would later recount to other slaves what he had observed that night, though his story would never reach white ears. He had been startled awake around midnight by noises from his master's study. Not the familiar rustle of papers or clink of brandy glasses, but something different. A low groan followed by the scrape of a chair being shot, veered backward. When Jupiter crept to the window to see, he spotted his master hunched over his desk, gripping his stomach while Mrs. Ruth stood beside him with a worried look, offering him a steaming cup of what seemed to be medicinal tea. "Drink this, my dear Edmund," Jupiter overheard her say in her soothing tone. "It will ease the pain. I prepared it with special care." Colonel Fairfax lifted his head with visible strain. His face, Jupiter noted with alarm, was pallid and slick with sweat despite the cool night breeze. "The pain. It's getting worse. Ruth, perhaps we should call for Dr. Harrison." Ruth's hand rested gently on her husband's shoulder. "Nonsense, darling. Dr. Harrison is miles away. And besides, this remedy has been in my family for generations. Trust me." Her voice carried that same melodic lilt that had captivated Richmond society. Yet in the darkness, Jupiter sensed something else beneath it, a tone of insistence that brooked no refusal. The colonel sipped from the cup, and within moments, his groaning grew harsher. Jupiter stared in terror as his master convulsed once, twice, then collapsed forward onto his desk, scattering papers and inkwells across the floor. Ruth stood perfectly still for several seconds, watching. Then, with movements that appeared eerily composed for a woman who had just seen her husband's apparent death throes, she picked up the cup, rinsed it carefully in a basin of water she had seemingly prepared beforehand, and only then began to scream for aid. When Dr. Harrison arrived at sunrise, he discovered Ruth in a posture of convincing despair, clinging to her husband's body and weeping uncontrollably. The symptoms she related were consistent with acute gastric distress, likely caused by spoiled food or nervous agitation. Colonel Fairfax had been engaged in some heated business disputes recently, she explained, and had complained of stomach pains for several days. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed nothing unusual. The colonel's body bore no signs of violence, and the gastric symptoms Ruth described were common enough in the Virginia heat, where rotten food and foul water frequently triggered similar illnesses. He documented the cause of death as acute gastric fever and extended his sympathies to the sorrowing widow. What Dr. Harrison did not know, and what Ruth had anticipated, was that the medicinal lore she claimed as family tradition truly originated from a far darker source. During her travel to Virginia, Ruth had lingered several weeks in Philadelphia, where she had cultivated an intimate association with a disgraced physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Wainwright had been expelled from practice after experimenting with various botanical extracts as a means of inducing undetectable deaths. His research, conducted covertly and never made public, had pinpointed several native plants capable of producing symptoms resembling ordinary sicknesses while leaving no trace in the body after demise. Ruth had not only absorbed Wainwright's techniques, but had refined them. She realized that by blending small quantities of certain plant alkaloids with common medicinal herbs, she could devise mixtures that alleviated genuine complaints in tiny doses, yet proved lethal when given in larger amounts or specific pairings. Her leather-bound journal held not ancestral cures but meticulously written formulas for murder veiled as medicine. The funeral of Colonel Fairfax drew the creme of Richmond society. Ruth portrayed the part of heartbroken widow flawlessly, swooning at the graveside and being upheld by compassionate friends. The colonel's will, drafted soon after their wedding, granted Ruth a sizable inheritance, including the Clay Street residence and a notable sum in gold and land holdings. But Ruth's mourning appeared strikingly brief. Within 3 months of the burial, she was observed welcoming the attentions of another eminent gentleman, Anne, Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate who had earned his fortune transporting supplies to the Continental Army during the war. Those who commented on the swiftness of her recovery were gently reminded that a woman alone in the world required protection, and Captain Randolph was known as a man of integrity and means. What none of Ruth's admirers realized was that she had not selected them by chance. Every man she pursued shared a mutual secret. They had all belonged to a covert society that supplied intelligence to British forces during the war. Colonel Fairfax had served as the group's treasurer, entrusted with distributing British gold to American traitors. Ruth's seemingly accidental arrival in Richmond and her ensuing romantic victories were anything but happenstance. They were the first calculated steps in a campaign of vengeance that would claim 8 lives before its conclusion. Captain William Randolph's demise, scarcely 8 months after his marriage to Ruth in January 1784, followed a hauntingly familiar pattern. The hardy sea captain, famed for his iron endurance and capacity to survive the harshest tempests along the Atlantic seaboard, fell victim to what Dr. Harrison classified as bilious fever after 3 days of agonizing stomach pain and exhaustion. By then, Jupiter had been sold into another household, yet the slave community maintained its own intricate network of news. Word traveled swiftly about the eerie coincidence of yet another of Mrs. Ruth's spouses perishing from stomach disorders. Old Caesar, who served in the Randolph residence, recounted similar details to those Jupiter once shared, his master falling ill after consuming medicinal tea prepared by his wife. Ruth's unnervingly calm manner throughout the ordeal, and her adamant refusal to summon any other physician. But it was Caesar who uncovered a clue crucial to grasping Ruth's meth. While tidying the captain's study after his death, Caesar discovered a small vial concealed behind a loose panel in the wall. The vial held a fine white powder with a faint scent of almonds and bitter herbs. When he displayed it to Jupiter during a chance meeting at the Richmond marketplace, the elder slave's face blanched. "Same thing I seen at Colonel Fairfax's house," Jupiter murmured, glancing around warily. "Found one just like it in the kitchen after the master died. When I showed it to the cook, she made me toss it in the river and warned me never to speak of it." The enslaved began keeping their own careful records, transmitting intelligence through their communal network. They noted that Ruth consistently insisted on personally concocting her husband's medicines, that she secured her supplies within a locked chest she forbade servants to touch, and that she possessed uncommon expertise regarding plants flourishing in Virginia's wilderness. Most unsettling of all, they observed that Ruth frequently ventured alone on lengthy walks through the forests encircling Richmond, returning with baskets of what appeared to be ordinary herbs, which she guarded fiercely. Meanwhile, Ruth's stature within Richmond society strengthened with each calamity. Captain Randolph's will had rendered her wealthier than ever, and her image as a devoted spouse who had endured grievous misfortunes earned her widespread sympathy. Virginia's leading families vied to include her in their social gatherings, seeing her as both an object of pity and an enviable ornament to their salons. Ruth's third consort was Judge Thomas Henley, an influential member of the Virginia House of Delegates and one of the architects of the state's emerging legal code. Their courtship was swift yet ardent, with the judge declaring that Ruth had rekindled his belief in love after losing his first wife during the war. They wedded in June 1785 in a ceremony hailed as one of the season's grandest events. Judge Henley endured precisely 7 months. His death in January 1786 was particularly shocking, for it unfolded during a dinner soiree at their residence with a dozen of Richmond's foremost citizens present. Henley had appeared in excellent condition and exuberant spirits throughout the night, enthralling his guests with anecdotes of constitutional debates and his aspirations for Virginia's destiny. It was only after Ruth served him a distinctive digestive tonic, prepared, she explained, from a recipe her late mother once used for her father, that the judge began to exhibit signs of distress. Dr. Harrison, summoned now for the third occasion to treat the fatal sickness of one of Ruth's husbands, began nurturing private doubts, yet suspicion alone was no proof, and Ruth's demeanor remained irreproachable. She had witnesses to her husband's decline. She had never been alone with him during his final moments, and the symptoms aligned with countless natural ailments. Moreover, she was a woman of flawless reputation, affluence, and social eminence. To accuse her of murder demanded evidence that simply did not exist, at least not in any form the courts would acknowledge. The sequence advanced with merciless precision. Husband number 4 was plantation master George Carrington, who perished of acute dyspepsia in 1787. Number 5 was merchant Samuel Bradford, who yielded to nervous fever in 1788. Number 6 was banker Edward Custis, dead from gastric apoplexy in 1789. Each passing left Ruth richer and more formidable. Each funeral saw her lamentations grow increasingly theatrical, and every new marriage stirred fresh whispers of coincidence that felt far too extraordinary to be natural. It was following Edward Custis's death that a pattern started to appear to those who watched closely. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the disgraced doctor Ruth had once known in Philadelphia, arrived in Richmond in late 1789, claiming to seek a new beginning in Virginia. He rented a modest home on the town's edge and lived quietly, treating few patients and keeping mostly to himself. Yet Caesar, now employed by a family near Wainwright's dwelling, noticed that Ruth frequently visited the doctor's house, always arriving at twilight and departing after nightfall. What Caesar could not know was that these visits were far from social calls, they were business dealings. Wainwright had uncovered Ruth's real identity through his own contacts, and had come to Richmond not to seek redemption, but to seize profit. He understood what Ruth was doing and why, and he wanted his share of the fortune she was amassing. Their arrangement was simple. He would keep supplying her with new and refined methods of poisoning, and she would pay him a portion of each inheritance. But Wainwright made a deadly misjudgment. He believed that since Ruth needed his knowledge, she would endure his demands for money and his bold proposals to broaden their scheme into other cities. He failed to see that Ruth's killings were driven not by mere greed, but by a quest for justice burning with a fury that would never bow to a partner's hunger. The sinister deaths that began with Colonel Fairfax were racing toward a climax destined to rattle Virginia's highest circles. Ruth had located the last members of the hidden network that betrayed her first husband, and her list was nearly finished. Just 2 names remained. Dr. Harrison himself, who had served as the group's liaison within the medical ranks, and the most influential prize of all, Governor Edmund Randolph, the formidable statesman who had orchestrated the entire treacherous scheme from his seat in the colonial administration. The autumn of 1790 brought an unforeseen twist to Ruth's calculated mission of vengeance. A newcomer in Richmond society would become both her greatest obstacle and the key to revealing the vast breadth of her deadly design. Captain Jonathan Hale was a former Continental Army intelligence officer who had been probing wartime trails on cases for the federal government. Officially, his presence in Richmond concerned property disputes stemming from Loyalist confiscations. Unofficially, he was following whispers of a covert network that had funneled American secrets to British forces during the conflict. His inquiry had led him to identify several individuals tied to this traitorous circle, and he had taken note. Many of them had perished under baffling circumstances in recent years. What made Captain Hale especially perilous to Ruth was his military skill in spotting patterns and his access to classified intelligence files naming suspected traitors. Unlike local authorities who saw nothing beyond an unlucky string of tragedies, Hale began detecting links that hinted at an intentional campaign of eradication. Hale's first major breakthrough emerged through his camaraderie with Dr. Harrison. During an offhand discussion about the uncanny tally of prominent men dying from gastric maladies in recent years, the doctor admitted his rising concern over the recurring deaths among Ruth's spouses. What disturbed Harrison most was that each man died despite receiving what seemed proper medical treatment from their devoted wife. "It's most peculiar," Jonathan, Dr. Harrison confided during a private dinner at his home. "Mrs. Holloway suffers the most dreadful misfortune with husbands, yet she's among the most attentive wives I have known. She possesses more knowledge of medicinal practices than many doctors, and she is always eager to aid in the care of her stricken partners. If I didn't know better, I'd swear she was striving to save them rather than—" He paused, unwilling to give shape to his suspicions. Captain Hale leaned closer with interest. "Rather than what, Doctor?" Harrison shook his head. "Forgive me, I should not speak ill of a woman who has endured such cruel bereavement. It's only that, in 3D, Hecades of medicine, I've never witnessed such a concentrated series of identical deaths in one household. That evening, Hale launched his own inquiry into Ruth Holloway's past. What he uncovered chilled his blood. There was no record of Captain Jonathan Holloway in Continental Army archives. No officer by that name had fallen at Yorktown or in any other battle. The woman calling herself Ruth Holloway had surfaced in Richmond under an entirely fabricated identity, and her true origins remained shrouded in mystery. Meanwhile, Ruth had chosen her seventh mark. Merchant Prince Alexander Fitzhugh, among the richest men in Virginia and a covert member of the treasonous circle she was methodically dismantling. Fitzhugh had earned his fortune by supplying British forces with intelligence on American supply convoys, enabling enemy raids that cost hundreds of patriot lives. His betrayal was particularly vile because he exploited his role as a supplier to the Continental Army to gather insight on American movements and vulnerabilities. Ruth's pursuit of Fitzhugh commenced in the winter of 1790, adhering to her familiar strategy. She portrayed herself as a lonely widow yearning for companionship and safety, while slowly revealing her broad grasp of commerce and finance. Fitzhugh, a widower himself, was enchanted by her blend of fragility and brilliance. Within 3 months he offered marriage, but this time Ruth encountered unforeseen scrutiny. Captain Hale had quietly tipped off several leading citizens to his doubts about the enigmatic widow, and murmurs had begun circulating within Richmond's close-knit aristocracy. When Fitzhugh declared his engagement to Ruth, several of his peers urged restraint. "Alexander, surely you've noticed the odd pattern," warned tobacco magnate Robert Carter during a discreet meeting at the Richmond Club. 7 husbands, 7 suspicious deaths. Even if one assumes Mrs. Holloway is merely cursed in matrimony, surely such a cluster of misfortune deserves inquiry. Fitzhugh's answer exposed the depth of Ruth's psychological sway. "Gentlemen, I grasp your worry, but I must emphasize your accusations rest on nothing but coincidence and chatter. Mrs. Holloway has been examined by the finest doctors and interrogated by the most esteemed magistrates. She has been exonerated repeatedly. Shall we condemn a woman because destiny has treated her cruelly?" What Fitzhugh never realized was that Ruth had been thoroughly analyzing his involvement in wartime treason, using records pilfered from Dr. Marcus Wainwright's archives. Wainwright, in his ongoing effort to blackmail Ruth for a larger share of her profits, had launched his own inquiry into her prey. He had uncovered that Ruth's targets were all bound by allegiance to a clandestine society called the Covenant of Prosperity, which coordinated intelligence with British troops for post-war commercial advantage. The discovery that Wainwright understood the covenant convinced Ruth her partner had grown too perilous to keep alive. On a frigid February evening in 1791, Dr. Marcus Wainwright was discovered lifeless in his home, apparently having ingested a lethal measure of his own experimental toxins. The magistrate's report concluded the disgraced doctor had ended his life rather than face exposure for unlawful experiments. Ruth attended Wainwright's burial with due solemnity, but inwardly she savored relief. The sole man who could tie her to exotic poisons was gone, and with his demise, the final external threat to her crusade had been erased. She now stood free to finish her work unopposed. Alexander Fitzhugh wed Ruth Holloway on March 15, 1791, in a ceremony far smaller and more restrained than her former nuptials. Captain Hale was present as a guest, observing Ruth closely throughout the event and noting her calm poise and seeming joy. If she truly was a serial killer, her ability to mask that truth was masterful. The Ion endured 4 months. Alexander Fitzhugh perished on July 20, 1791, following a sudden illness that began with abdominal torment and ended in total systemic failure. Dr. Harrison, now profoundly suspicious yet still lacking definitive evidence, performed the most exhaustive autopsy of his career. He uncovered nothing constituting legal proof of poisoning, though privately he was certain Fitzhugh had been slain. Ruth's display as the grieving widow soared to unmatched theatrical brilliance. She collapsed at the funeral, required smelling salts for revival, and spent weeks in seclusion, seemingly consumed by sorrow. Yet those familiar with her began detecting subtle shifts in demeanor. She appeared bolder, more commanding, and less invested in sustaining the guise of frail femininity that had served her for so long. With Fitzhugh's passing, Ruth possessed a fortune, elevating her among the richest women in Virginia. Far more critical, she had eradicated 7 of the 8 members of the Covenant of Prosperity. Only a single name remained: Dr. Harrison himself, the physician who had acted as the group's medical conduit and who now stood as the gravest threat to her continued freedom. Yet Ruth had never imagined that Captain Hale's relentless inquiry would lead him to unearth her authentic identity and the true motive behind her lethal mission. In the files of a seized British intelligence operative, Hale uncovered mentions of an American spy ring that included a woman known only as the Widow. This enigmatic figure had allegedly lost her spouse to Patriot forces and had vowed vengeance against those who caused his demise. By cross-referencing this data with military archives, Hale stumbled upon a stunning revelation. Captain Jonathan Holloway was indeed real, but he had served as a British agent embedded deeply within the Continental Army. He had been seized and executed by American troops in 1779 after betrayal by members of his own espionage circle, the same group that later evolved into the Covenant of Prosperity. Ruth Holloway is not pursuing justice for Patriot disloyalty. She was exacting vengeance for the execution of a traitor. Her husband had been a British operative, and his death had been both lawful and deserved. The Covenant's members had not betrayed him to the British, but to the Americans, eager to erase a rival who knew too much about their own acts of treason. This discovery altered every aspect of the investigation, but it also rendered Ruth infinitely more perilous. She was not a mourning Patriot widow bent on punishing defectors. She was a British loyalist, assassinating American patriots who had secured victory in the Revolution. Her string of killings was not justice, it was treachery itself. Captain Hale's uncovering of Ruth's identity arrived at a pivotal moment, for he learned she had already embarked on her last seduction. Her 8th and ultimate quarry was not Dr. Harrison, as Hale had suspected, but Governor Edmund Randolph himself, the most influential man in Virginia and the clandestine head of the Covenant of Prosperity. The governor's fascination with Ruth had been methodically cultivated over many months. She positioned herself at social gatherings where she knew he would appear, orchestrated introductions through mutual acquaintances, and gradually unveiled herself as a woman of exceptional intellect and grace. Unlike her earlier conquests, Governor Randolph was already wed, yet Ruth observed that his wife was chronically ill and confined to bed. Ruth's strategy toward Randolph deviated from her prior methods. Instead of posing as a fragile widow seeking protection, she presented herself as a woman of independent means, a formidable political partner. She displayed an extraordinary grasp of Virginia politics and proved to be an astute evaluator of character and ambition. In essence, she rendered herself indispensable to a man whose aspirations stretched far beyond and the governor's estate. What made this pursuit particularly hazardous was that Governor Randolph was a figure of remarkable intellect and seasoned experience. He had navigated the ruthless tides of revolutionary politics, assisted in drafting the Constitution, and constructed a vast web of allies and informants across Virginia and beyond. If anyone could perceive Ruth's authentic self, it would be him. But Ruth possessed one decisive edge. She understood precisely the sort of man Randolph truly was beneath his public image, while he perceived her solely as she wished to be seen. Through her investigation into the Covenant of Prosperity, Ruth had discovered that Randolph's wartime treason stemmed not from principle, but from sheer ambition. He had supplied the British with intelligence because he believed the rebellion would collapse and wanted to secure his position in the aftermath. When it became evident that the Americans would triumph, he betrayed his British associates to salvage his own standing. In the spring of 1792, Governor Randolph's wife succumbed to consumption after a prolonged illness. Ruth attended the burial and extended her sympathies with flawless decorum. She then withdrew from society for several weeks, ostensibly to prevent any hint of impropriety during the governor's mourning period. During this pause, Captain Hale launched a desperate bid to warn Governor Randolph about Ruth's murderous trail. He sought a confidential meeting and presented his proof: the unsettling sequence of deaths, Ruth's forged identity, and the link between her victims and wartime treason. Yet Hale's disclosure produced an unforeseen reaction from the governor. Rather than recoiling in alarm at Ruth's deadly record, Randolph admired her cunning and resolve. Here was a woman who had eradicated 7 men without ever being apprehended or even seriously accused by law. Her tactics were subtle, her planning precise, and her execution immaculate. Instead of perceiving her as a menace, he began to regard her as an invaluable asset. "Captain Hale," the governor said after absorbing the officer's dire warnings, "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, but I fear you may have misread Mrs. Holloway's circumstances. If she truly has been removing enemies of the state, men who betrayed their homeland during the war, then she's been performing a significant service. Perhaps it's time someone acknowledged her patriotic deeds instead of treating them with distrust." Hale departed the meeting gripped by mounting dread. Governor Randolph had not only dismissed his cautions but seemed genuinely eager to align himself with a confessed killer. The consequences were chilling. If Ruth and the governor united, they could destroy whomever they wished, using the full authority of state power to erase any evidence. What Captain Hale did not realize was that Governor Randolph had already initiated his own probe into Ruth's past, and his discoveries had driven him to an entirely different interpretation of her intentions. Through his informant network, he had uncovered her true identity and her link to the executed British operative Jonathan Holloway. He knew Ruth sought vengeance upon the Covenant's members, and he understood that he was likely her ultimate objective. Yet rather than run or request protection, Governor Randolph resolved to meet Ruth head-on. He believed her craving for vengeance could be redirected toward more productive goals, and that her expertise as a killer could further his political aspirations. To him, Ruth Holloway was not a menace to be destroyed, but a weapon to command. The confrontation unfolded during an exclusive dinner at the governor's mansion in June 1792. Ruth had accepted his invitation, expecting a romantic advance. Instead, she encountered a man fully aware of her identity and every act she had committed. "Mrs. Holloway," the governor said as they sat in his secluded study after dinner, "or should I say, Mrs. Jonathan Holloway, widow of the British operative executed for treason in 1779. I believe it's time we drop the charade and speak frankly about your position." Ruth's response was instant, yet measured. Her fingers drifted almost invisibly toward the tiny vial of poison concealed in her reticule, but halted when she noticed the governor watching with amused curiosity rather than terror. "I see we understand each other," Randolph continued. "Excellent. That will simplify our arrangement. You see, my dear, I know everything about your vendetta against the Covenant of Prosperity's members. I know you've successfully slain 7 of the 8, and I know you presume me to be the 8th and last name on your list." Ruth's grey eyes never shifted from his face as she finally broke her silence. "And are you not frightened, Governor? You betrayed my husband to preserve yourself, and you've observed me kill 7 men without raising a hand to warn or stop me. Why should you believe I won't finish tonight?" Randolph's smile was icy. "Because, my dear Mrs. Holloway, you require me alive far more than dead. You see, there weren't 8 members of the Covenant, there were 9. The shock struck Ruth like a crushing blow. For over 10 years she had been convinced her list was complete, that destroying the 8 conspirators would fulfill her vengeance. Now she discovered there was another traitor, another mark, another life to take before her mission could end. "Who?" she breathed, her calm finally faltering. "Captain Jonathan Hale," the governor declared, "the very man who's been tracking your every move with such determination. He was the Covenant's intelligence strategist, the one who flagged your husband as a liability and urged his removal. He's pursued you not from loyalty to justice, but from dread you'd uncover his hand in your husband's execution. And just when you thought the tale couldn't darken, Richmond plunges deeper into horror. If this story sends shivers down your spine, share it with a friend who craves sinister mysteries. Smash that like button to keep our stories alive, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another chilling twist. Now let's uncover together what unfolds next in this deadly chess match of retribution and deceit. The duel between Ruth Holloway and Governor Randolph was about to enter its ultimate and most perilous stage, with Captain Hale as the unsuspecting prize in a clash between 2 of history's most merciless killers. Governor Randolph's disclosure about Captain Hale reshaped Ruth's purpose from a straightforward vendetta into a tangled maze of betrayal and double-cross that would pit her against the most formidable adversary she had ever confronted. But the governor had misjudged Ruth's mindset. He assumed her hunger for absolute vengeance would make her eager to embrace him as an ally. Instead, it only strengthened her resolve to destroy every figure tied to the plot that had shattered her existence. "You suggest an alliance, Governor," Ruth said, her tone steady despite the shock of learning Hale's true identity. "But what guarantee do I have that you won't betray me as you betrayed my husband, as you betrayed Britain, as you betrayed your fellow conspirators?" Randolph leaned back in his chair, observing Ruth with the calculating stare of a man skilled at weighing the worth and threat of possible partners and foes. "Because, my dear, we both hold knowledge that could annihilate the other. You know of my wartime dealings, and I know of your murderous crusade. We're bound together by mutual assured destruction." But Ruth had already reached her verdict. The exchange with Randolph had achieved its purpose. She now possessed the name of her ninth and final target, and she had confirmed that the governor was every bit as cold and corrupt as she'd suspected. There would be no alliance, no partnership, no shared destiny. There would only be death. What ensued was a lethal game of predator and prey unfolding over several weeks in the summer of 1792. Ruth pretended to embrace Randolph's offer while secretly plotting to eliminate both him and Captain Hale. The governor, on the other hand, believed he'd secured a prized assassin while scheming to dispose of her once her usefulness expired. Captain Hale, ignorant that his real identity had been exposed, pressed forward with his probe into Ruth's deeds. He had begun compiling proof he hoped would suffice to indict her, including statements from multiple slaves who had observed suspicious conduct in households where Ruth's husbands had perished. What he didn't realize was that both Ruth and Governor Randolph were monitoring his every step, each intending to twist his investigation to their own advantage. The climax erupted on the night of August the 15th, 1792, exactly 9 years after Colonel Fairfax's demise. Ruth had summoned both Governor Randolph and Captain Hale to an exclusive dinner at her estate, claiming to discuss a business arrangement profitable to all three. Each man agreed, convinced he held control of the unfolding contest. The dinner advanced with flawless civility, Ruth presenting herself as the gracious hostess while her guests traded polite discourse on politics and trade. Yet beneath the polished surface, a lethal tension mounted. Each person at the table knew more than they were revealing, each waiting for the precise instant to strike. Ruth had engineered her most intricate poisoning scheme yet, employing an array of methods perfected across years of experience. Rather than a single venom, she devised multiple toxins designed to act in unison, producing deaths no coroner could trace. The brilliance of her design was that each victim would suffer a different poison, making their ends appear as unrelated misfortunes instead of synchronized executions. For Governor Randolph, she prepared a slow-acting blend of foxglove and hemlock to mimic cardiac failure, appropriate for a man of his age and high-pressure station. The dose had been expertly calculated and dissolved into an exquisite French brandy procured expressly for the evening. She would present it as a rare vintage, a toast to their supposed alliance. Captain Hale's fate was entirely different. Ruth had conceived a strikingly ingenious method for his death, a contact toxin smeared along the rim of his wineglass, absorbing through his skin to trigger symptoms resembling apoplexy. The elegance of this ploy was that the fatality would come hours later, allowing Hale to depart her home seemingly vigorous and perish in his own chambers, erasing any link to the gathering. But Ruth had not foreseen that Governor Randolph would arrive already armed with knowledge of her intentions. Through his circle of servants and informants, he had uncovered her recent movements, her purchases of rare botanicals, her nocturnal trips to deserted sites where she concocted her brews, and most damning, the unearthing of her journal chronicling each prior killing. As the trio settled for dinner, Ruth observed that Governor Randolph appeared unusually calm and self-assured, while Captain Hale looked strained and preoccupied. She read this as proof that her illusion was working. Randolph confident in his role as her partner, Hale growing wary yet still oblivious to the breadth of his peril. The conversation during the meal exposed the intricate psychological interplay at work. Ruth spoke passionately about justice and retribution, weaving philosophical musings into casual banter. "I've always believed," she remarked while serving the entree, "that those who violate trust deserve to face the outcome of their deeds regardless of how much time has passed." Governor Randolph nodded with a look of approval. "Indeed, Mrs. Holloway, justice postponed is not justice denied, especially when delay ensures that the final reckoning is absolute." Captain Hale, growing more uneasy with the course of the conversation, tried to shift the dialogue towards safer ground. "Surely we can acknowledge that vengeance, however justified it may appear, is ultimately ruinous to both the avenger and the fabric of society. The law exists for the very purpose of preventing individuals from dispensing justice on their own terms." Ruth's smile was icy as she replied, "But Captain, what happens when the law itself is poisoned by those most deserving of judgment? What path remains for the wronged, when the very structures created to uphold justice are seized by the guilty?" It was then that Captain Hale realized he wasn't merely a guest at this dinner, he was prey. The philosophical debate was not hypothetical, it was Ruth's method of explaining why she intended to end his life. His hand drifted instinctively toward his coat, where a pistol rested, but Governor Randolph's sharp glance cautioned him against rash moves. "Gentlemen," Ruth said, rising from her chair with elegant poise, "I think it's time we retire to the library for brandy and candid conversation. I have something quite special to share with you both." As they advanced into the library, each participant fully understood they were stepping into the ultimate confrontation of a deadly contest simmering for more than a decade. Ruth had placed herself between her two intended victims and the exit, sealing off their most obvious path of escape. Governor Randolph registered the tactical placement, yet remained certain in his capacity to outwit a woman he still considered a valuable but ultimately disposable instrument. Captain Hale, now convinced of his peril, calculated his odds of survival should he risk a desperate bid to fight his way clear. The library, Ruth's chosen stage for her climax, was perfectly crafted for her aim. Heavy drapes sealed the windows, muting sound from outside. Every servant had been dismissed for the night, guaranteeing no witnesses to whatever would transpire. Most critical of all, Ruth had arranged the room with all that was necessary to erase two bodies and fabricate credible causes for their demise. "Now then," Ruth said, approaching a sideboard gleaming with crystal decanters, "I promised you truth, and I intend to deliver. Governor Randolph, you imagine you've maneuvered me into becoming your private assassin. Captain Hale, you believe you've collected sufficient evidence to indict me for the murders of my 8 husbands. Both of you are correct in those conclusions, and both fatally mistaken in what you assume I intend to do with this knowledge." She pivoted toward them, clutching 2 glasses of what looked like costly French brandy. "The reality is that neither of you leaves this room breathing. Governor Randolph, you perish because you led the conspiracy that slew my husband. Captain Hale, you die because you were the analyst who marked him as a threat. Your deaths will complete my quest and grant me the justice I have sought for 13 relentless years." Governor Randolph's composure fractured at last as he grasped that his scheming had collapsed entirely. "Mrs. Holloway, I think you misjudge the consequences of assassinating a sitting governor. My demise will not pass unnoticed or unexamined. You cannot simply add me to your roster of victims and expect to avoid inquiry." Ruth's laugh was filled with genuine amusement. "Governor, I have slain 8 eminent men without once drawing real suspicion. I have amassed wealth, secured status among the elite, and eradicated nearly every adversary while preserving the guise of a grieving widow worthy of sympathy and protection. Why would you believe killing you and Captain Hale will pose any greater obstacle?" Captain Hale, his soldier's instincts finally overruling his shock, sprang into action. Instead of running or bargaining, he lunged straight for Ruth, hoping to strip her of whatever poison she intended to use, but Ruth had foreseen such a gambit and was primed for it. As Hale rushed forward, Ruth hurled the contents of 1 brandy glass directly into his eyes. The liquid contained no toxin, but a potent irritant distilled from Virginia flora that induced searing pain and temporary blindness. As Hale reeled back, clawing at his burning vision, Ruth drew a small pistol from beneath her shawl, a weapon she had taken from one of her earlier victims and reserved for dire circumstances. Governor Randolph, spotting his chance, lunged to subdue Ruth while her attention remained on Hale, but he had gravely misjudged both her strength and her readiness for this encounter. Ruth whirled toward him with seamless precision, leveling the pistol squarely at his chest. "I don't think so, Governor," she stated evenly. "After all these years of scheming, I won't allow either of you to ruin my hour of triumph." The clash that ensued exposed the full scope of Ruth's metamorphosis from bereaved widow to meticulous predator. She had evolved into something far deadlier than a mere poisoner. She was a tactician who had spent more than a decade refining not just her lethal methods, but her mastery of human behavior and the frailties that could be exploited even in the most influential men. "You wish to hear the truth about your vaunted covenant of prosperity?" Ruth asked, keeping the weapon aimed at Randolph while ensuring she tracked Hale, who was slowly recovering from the agony inflicted on his eyes. It wasn't some patriotic society striving to eliminate British operatives. It was a band of ambitious opportunists who bartered secrets to the highest bidder, shifting loyalties whenever it served their ambitions. "You condemned my husband, not because he endangered American freedom, but because he uncovered proof of your treachery and prepared to expose you to both factions." Governor Randolph's complexion drained as Ruth divulged her awareness of the Covenant's true dealings. "How could you possibly know that? Those archives were obliterated years ago." Ruth's smile was frigid. "Governor, you erred in presuming that a woman driven by devotion and grief would be less thorough in her pursuit than a man driven by political greed. I have spent 13 years hunting down every ledger, every witness, every fragment of evidence tied to my husband's death and your cabal's schemes. I know more about the covenant of prosperity than any surviving conspirator ever grasped. What Ruth disclosed next would shatter the bedrock of Virginia's post-revolutionary order. The covenant hadn't merely sold intelligence to Britain during the struggle. They engineered an elaborate design to enrich themselves from both camps while securing advantage regardless of who prevailed. They pilfered provisions destined for the Continental forces, marketed critical intelligence that ensured American disasters, and removed rivals who imperiled their monopoly on betrayal. "My husband uncovered your ploy in 1779, Ruth pressed on, but instead of presenting it to British command, he sought to extort you. That was his fatal blunder. You couldn't permit him to reveal your plots, yet you couldn't kill him outright without courting peril, so you denounced him to the Continental Army as a British operative, knowing patriot justice would erase your dilemma while painting you as loyal champions of liberty." Captain Hale, his sight gradually clearing, at last grasped the immensity of the intrigue surrounding him for the last decade. "Dear God," he muttered, "you're not pursuing justice for British loyalists. You're pursuing vengeance for the corruption that slaughtered your husband." Ruth inclined her head with quiet approval. "Finally, Captain, you comprehend. Jonathan was indeed a British agent, but he was also my husband, and the father of the child I lost returned, and I fled after his execution. Your conspiracy didn't merely kill him, it obliterated everything I had created, everything I loved, everything that gave meaning to my existence. You molded me into the weapon I have become." The psychological image revealed during this showdown cast Ruth Holloway as something unparalleled in American criminal annals. A woman who dismantled an entire treasonous network through patience, intellect, and an almost preternatural grasp of human impulses. She hadn't merely slain her marks. She had examined them, exploited their flaws, and wielded those weaknesses to engineer their ruin. Governor Randolph, in one frantic gamble to preserve his life, made a final proposal. "Mrs. Holloway, if you let me live, I can offer something far greater than revenge. I can offer power. With my influence and your singular talents, we could dominate not only Virginia, but steer the entire federal structure. Imagine what we might achieve together." Ruth's reply laid bare the depth of her devotion to her cause and her utter evolution from the helpless widow she once seemed to be. "Governor, you still fail to grasp what sustains me. This was never about influence or fortune or stature within society. This was about love. Love for a man you slaughtered. Love for a life you shattered. Love for justice that your rotten system could never grant. Power corrupts, as you have so vividly shown, but love persists, and love demands its reckoning." "All right. The final seconds of the standoff played out with the precision and inevitability of a flawlessly executed plan. Ruth had crafted every element of this night, not just to eliminate her last targets, but to guarantee that their deaths would seem to result from their own choices rather than her design. The corpses of Governor Edmund Randolph and Captain Jonathan Hale were found the next morning by attendants arriving to ready the mansion for the day. The tableau awaiting them seemed to tell an unmistakable and sorrowful tale. The two men had apparently engaged in a brutal altercation that ended with both lying dead. Governor Randolph lay in the library with a bullet lodged in his chest, Captain Hale's pistol gripped in his fingers. Captain Hale sprawled nearby, apparently having succumbed to a mix of chemical burns on his face and a crushing strike to the skull from a heavy crystal decanter shattered beside his form. The chamber bore evidence of a frantic fight, with furnishings overturned and papers strewn across the ground. Ruth Holloway was discovered tied and gagged inside a closet off the library, seemingly having been confined there during the clash between the two men. When freed by the horrified staff, she collapsed in visible shock and grief, unable for several minutes to coherently recount what had occurred. When Dr. Harrison arrived to inspect the remains and question Ruth, her telling of the evening's ordeal was both heart-wrenching and persuasive. She explained that Captain Hale had appeared at dinner in a distressed state, hurling wild claims about Governor Randolph's wartime deeds and insisting she testify to sustain charges of treason. The governor had first tried to calm matters, but when Hale produced papers that appeared to incriminate Randolph in wartime graft, the argument surged beyond restraint. They started screaming at each other. Ruth wept to Dr. Harrison, and then Captain Hale pulled his pistol. The governor tried to wrench it away from him, and in the scuffle it fired. Captain Hale was harmed by the shattered glass, and then I cannot recall clearly. Someone seized me and shoved me into the closet. I heard more fighting and then silence. Dr. Harrison's review of the evidence backed Ruth's version. The material clues matched a vicious brawl between two men, and Ruth's wounds, rope marks on her wrists and ankles, bruises aligned with rough handling, appeared authentic. Moreover, her image as a virtuous widow who had endured dreadful grief rendered it unthinkable that she could have engineered such brutality herself. The probe that followed was perfunctory at most, with both prime actors dead and Ruth's narrative offering a credible rationale for their demise. The officials concluded that Captain Hale and Governor Randolph had slain one another during a quarrel over wartime treason charges. The papers Hale had seemingly presented to support his claims were uncovered, burned in the library hearth, their contents gone forever. What the examiners never realized was that Ruth had invested months arranging this precise outcome. The documents Hale had purportedly carried were forgeries she had composed to supply a motive for the fight. The substance that had seared Hale's eyes was a mixture she had designed specifically to leave signs compatible with an accidental wound in combat. Even her own injuries were self-imposed, using methods she had mastered from years studying how to inflict pain and trauma without lasting harm. The deaths of Governor Randolph and Captain Hale closed Ruth Holloway's crusade for vengeance, but not the close of her saga. With the eradication of all 9 members of the Covenant of Prosperity, she had secured the justice she had craved for more than 10 years. Beyond that, she had amassed enough wealth and status to guarantee her safety for the remainder of her existence. In the months after the killings, Ruth slowly withdrew from Richmond society. She claimed that the harrowing ordeal in her library had impaired her health and capacity for social interaction. She sold her estate and relocated to a smaller yet refined residence on the city's edge, where she lived discreetly with only a handful of loyal attendants. But Ruth's retreat from active killing did not mean she had abandoned her appetite for influence and control. Through the ensuing years, she evolved into a covert force in Virginia politics, employing her fortune and her knowledge of influential figures' secrets to sway elections, broker ventures, and shape social tides. She never wedded again, asserting that she had endured too much heartbreak to hazard her spirit once more. But she kept alliances and correspondence with influential men across the state and beyond. The full scope of Ruth's power became clear only after her passing in 1834 at the age of 80. Among her documents, authorities uncovered meticulous accounts not only of her 9 killings, but of dozens of other plots she had engineered through the years. She had extorted dishonest officials, driven business rivals into collapse, and orchestrated the social ruin of anyone who defied her or jeopardized her ambitions. Perhaps most astonishing of all was the unearthing of Ruth's complete diary, written in a cipher that took codebreakers months to unravel. The diary disclosed that her crusade against the covenant of prosperity had been merely the start of her vocation as what she termed an agent of necessary justice. She continued eliminating those she judged worthy of death, yet had perfected her method so thoroughly that her role was never once suspected. The entries from her later life portrayed a woman wholly remade by her ordeals. The sorrowful widow who arrived in Richmond in 1782 had become something unheard of in American history. A female crime lord who acted not for wealth or dominance but for her own warped vision of moral balance. "I have become something that perhaps God never wished to exist," she penned in one of her final reflections, but which the depravity of this world has made essential. "I am justice without law, vengeance without pity, and order without state. I have assumed the duty of erasing those whom society will not chastise, and I have done so without remorse or delay." The exposure of Ruth's journal caused an uproar in Virginia circles, yet it also presented officials with an unresolvable dilemma. Many individuals she confessed to killing had perished so long ago that no inquiry was feasible. Others were leading figures whose names could not be stained without unleashing grave political and cultural turmoil. Ultimately, the choice was made to lock away the journal and brand the entire affair a matter of state secrecy. The tale of Ruth Holloway stayed hidden in the vaults of the Virginia Historical Society for nearly 200 years, emerging only rarely in the research of scholars probing the post-revolutionary era. But those few historians who encountered her file were invariably shaken by the systematic character of her offenses and the psychological depth of her approach. Contemporary forensic authorities who have examined Ruth's strategies have decided she was generations ahead in grasping how to commit invisible murders. Her reliance on botanical toxins, her alteration of crime scenes, and her capacity to forge false personas and motives would not be matched by criminal specialists until the late 20th century. But maybe the most chilling element of Ruth Holloway's saga is not her proficiency as a killer, but her mastery as a manipulator of public perception. For over 5 decades, she preserved her image as a sorrowful soul, worthy of compassion and shelter, while secretly functioning as one of the deadliest murderers in America's chronicles. She illustrated that the gravest criminals are not those acting beyond society, but those who learn to bend society from inside. The meaning of her case still echoes with law enforcement experts and psychologists even now. Ruth Holloway proved that the blend of intellect, endurance, and absolute moral absence could permit a lone person to undermine an entire cultural structure for private ends. She formed a blueprint for mental domination and orchestrated killing that has been analyzed and copied by lawbreakers ever since. This enigma demonstrates how vengeance, when pursued with relentless cunning and boundless patience, can deform even the most polished facade into something monstrous. Ruth Holloway's evolution from bereaved widow to cold strategist uncovers the horrifying potential lying dormant within supposedly cultured civilization. What do you think of this account? Do you believe someone could truly execute such a vast campaign of revenge without ever being exposed? Could Ruth's tactics succeed in today's age? Or would modern forensic science have stopped her? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share your theories. If this tale intrigued you and you crave more historical horror stories like it, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with anyone obsessed with chilling mysteries. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous predators are often those who look most refined, and the worst crimes are those history chooses to bury. See you in the next episode.